Bobby Fischer forces Tigran Petrosian to resign by placing both his rooks on the 7th rank, and Bobby Fischer is playing with the white pieces, and Tigran Petrosian is playing with the black pieces. And now this is the Sicilian on the board, and the Sicilian defense, that is the French variation open of the Sicilian defense, is played. And after c into d4, the c pawn takes the d4 pawn, knight takes the d4 pawn, and a6 is played, preventing the knight and the bishop from coming here, launching an attack on the central d pawn. So the bishop develops to d3 and knight to c6 by Tigran Petrosian, and the knight captures the knight at c6, and the pawn captures back here. So it's always good to capture here, because once you capture with your queen pawn, it exposes the queen, and because the queen doesn't have any support right now, so if the queen get exchanged, the king will be displaced and you can't castle in Sicilian. So it's always better to take with the b pawn, and castles on the king side Fischer, and d5 by Petrosian, attacking the center e pawn, and Fischer immediately counterattacks with the c4, attacking the center, and the knight to f6 attacking the e pawn, and after the c pawn takes the d5 pawn, Tigran does the same and captures back with his pawn, and the e pawn takes the d5 pawn, and he does the same, and the knight goes to c3 attacking the central isolated pawn. So basically now you have these two central isolated pawns. So these pawns actually can be an asset and sometimes can be a liability, because this pawn is particularly dangerous because it's not obstructed by any other uh, opposition pawns, so it can go down the board with the support of other pieces and queen, and also can create massive pressure in the center of the board pretty early. So the knight comes to c3 attacking that center pawn, and bishop to e7 looking for castle on the king side. The bishop goes queen to a4 plus, creating a check, and the queen comes up blocking the check here, and Fischer immediately brings his rook to e1, and here there is a little bit of tactic here. So if the let's say if you castle on the king side right now, you can just go for the queen capture, and once the queen get exchanged, this bishop will be hanging. So that forced the exchange of the queens, and once the queens are exchanged, knight takes the queens back, and bishop comes to e6, blocking the attack on this particular bishop, and this also allows the castling on the king side. So bishop to e3 by Fischer, getting ready his final dark square bishop, and Tigran Petrosian then castles on the king side as of the 15th move, and the bishop goes to c5 attacking this undefended bishop, and which allows this rook to e8 move, defending the bishop. So once the bishop captured the bishop, the rook captured the bishop, and creating an opposition on the e file basically. So now b4 is played by Fischer, which is a very quite important move, because now this knight is a little bit out of place after the queen exchange. You can bring this knight into this outpost and have good control on the black's squares on the black side of the board. So the king comes, try to come closer to the board, king to f8, and the knight comes to c5, reorienting the knight and bringing it back into the game. So he didn't want to exchange that knight for that particular bishop. So the bishop goes to c8 and f3 by Fischer, which actually helps the king to come up the board. And rook goes to a7, supporting the pawn over there. And because this pawn was attacked twice, basically, and it was only defended once by the rook, so it had to go there. So this allows rook to e5 by Fischer, and also give him control of the open e file. And after that, the bishop comes to d7 now, and now the knight captures that bishop now, and rook captures the bishop back, and now rook to c1 by Fischer, giving him control of both the open c file and e file. Now the rook comes to d6, supporting this weak backward pawn. So as mentioned earlier, now these pawns can be an asset and can be a liability, so you have to support the pawn. And when you have such isolated pawns, especially when you play Sicilians, you'll have to mobilize your pieces to support these pawns. And rook to c7, going into the 7th rank by Fischer, and knight comes to d7, blocking any influence on the 7th rank, and also attacking the rook over here. So the rook goes back to e2 and g6 by Petrosian looking to push his pawns forward, and king comes up the board by the king to f2 move of Fischer, and h5 by Petrosian, and f4 by Fischer, preventing the march of the pawns there. And the h4 move was played because you cannot push this pawn forward now. And after that, the king goes to f3 now, bringing the making the king more active towards the end game, and f5 by Petrosian, and the king goes to e3. The intent is to bring your king here, try to block this isolated pass. The pawn, once it passes, it can become a dangerous piece. So the pawn comes forward d4 with the support of the rook and creates a check. And now the king had to go back to d2 and protecting the entry of that pass pawn deeper into white's territory to queen. So knight goes to b6, which actually starts the beginning of the end for Petrosian, so which allows this rook to come here. And the rooks, once they're doubled on the 7th rank, are really dangerous pieces, and it's almost like game over for black. So but the knight can come to d5, but because of the because the king is exposed, you can just place a check like this, and once the king moves away, you can move your other rook as well. So the earlier this uh, fork on both the rooks are gone because of the exposure of the king, and once you are in such position, you will lose this particular pawn. But after the bishop to c4 move, Petrosian had to resign because there is no way that he is going to avoid checkmate, and was checkmate written all over the board right now, no matter what move he plays. So one of the combination is trying to delay the checkmate is that you can just keep your knight here blocking the attack of the bishop. So knight to e6, which will bring this check, and you will basically lose that particular knight. And after that, the rook can come and attack that particular pawn, so the bishop will retrieve. And even if you take the pawn, you can just bring here rook to a7, threaten a checkmate, and now the king will have to come up to a7 so that you can just block it back with your rook. So once the check is blocked back, you can take back the pawn, and you'll have to capture with your rook, because if you move the king, the game will be lost. So once it happened, the rook takes the rook back, and once the rook goes here, it's a check, and the rook will have to block again. And after the following combination, basically it's a checkmate now, basically on the board. So that's why Petrosian resigned as of once this move is played, because the writing was on the wall. And like super GMs and masters, once they are in such a position, they will just resign the game. So masterful play by Fischer, keeping both his rook on the 7th rank, and he was willing to sacrifice one more pawn, basically. So he already had a passed pawn threatening to queen, and he also have a pawn majority on the king side, but still Fischer had a better position because of the position of the rook and the bishops, which will force checkmate on the board. So thanks very much for watching. I'll be back with more such videos.